this is your host, Julia Napini. I am a clinical and forensic social worker who owns a counseling practice and a consulting business. In this show, we discuss the challenges of being successful in business while maintaining your integrity and staying true to yourself. Join me while I interview other professionals and share insights from life and experience. Let's talk about RingRx, our latest sponsor. RingRx is a high-quality, HIPAA-compliant telephone, text, and fax communications platform. They provide seamless, cost-effective communications for behavioral therapists, medical practices, hospitals, and other healthcare providers. RingRx is designed for modern healthcare environments. They offer customizable features like a phone app, automated patient outreach, voicemail, after-hours call routing, and top-quality desk phones. Try RingRx for free today at ringrx.com. And if you sign up using the code CLIMB, you'll get 15% off your monthly bill forever. Conditions apply. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Compassionate Climb podcast. I am very excited to have this guest with us today to talk about his podcast network. We have spoken about podcasting before, but this will be an interesting spin on it. So Gordon Brewer, welcome to the show.
Well, glad to be here, Julia.
Happy to have you.
Yes.
So I would love if you would introduce yourself for the audience. Tell those of us that are under a rock and don't know who you are and what you're all about, what it is that you do.
Well, again, thanks for having me. So I'm Gordon, and I am a marriage and family therapist, licensed marriage and family therapist. I'm located in Northeast Tennessee, up in the beautiful Appalachian Mountains, where Tennessee and North Carolina and Virginia and Kentucky kind of all come together up there in that corner. But I'm a group practice owner. I have a small group practice, Kingsport Counseling Associates. And so it's a, general, counseling practice. I also have, probably most people know me from the practice of therapy, which is started out as a blog, but I started a podcast in 2017, and the podcast is just about really geared towards therapists and private practice building and different ways in which people can, make their practices better or start practices, that kind of thing, and provide resources and that sort of thing for people in private practice. And so started the podcast, and then in 2022, last year, I started the podcast network that's called the PsychCraft Network of podcasts. And we're now up to, I think, 15 different podcasts in the network. And so most all of them are in this niche of mental health or self-help or self-improvement. Some of them are more business-facing. Others are more public-facing. And I need to mention, too, I've got a second podcast called the Kindness and Compassion Podcast, which I started in 2021, I guess, is when I started that. So, so been doing a lot with podcasting here in recent years.
To say the least. You're a busy guy, Gordon. How do you fit it all in?
Sometimes I wonder, and this is one of those days I'm thinking, okay, how am I going to get it all done?
Oh, I can totally relate. Well, I have to comment on the fact that you were into podcasting before it was what it is today. And you stuck with it. And you've created a network and enabled other people to broaden their reach. So tell me more about what got you interested at that time and kept you motivated, because that can be tough.
Yeah. So I guess how I got interested in podcasting is I probably around that time, or maybe even a little earlier than that. I don't know exactly what year I started listening to podcasts, and was listening to some other podcasts on practice building, and then just some other just general entertainment kind of podcasts. And I would do, what I noticed is that, it was a really good medium for me as far as learning new stuff, because
Yes.
I'm kind of an auditory learner. The way I read now is with Audible and, anything of that sort. And I was listening to some podcasts that were already out there. Uh, Selling the Couch, Melvin Verghese, and
Yes.
Practice of the Practice with Joe Sanok, and then several others that were kind of coming on the the horizon then.
Mm-hmm.
And as I was listening to a lot of them, I was thinking, I've learned a lot in my practice the hard way. And
Mm-hmm.
so I just thought, well, I'll try to share this with others. And started blogging about it. And then in 2017, I was really, the blog was picking up, and I started creating a few online courses and that kind of thing. And, you know, podcasting was really, you were really starting to see it catch on with people
Yeah.
around that time. And so I thought, well, I'll give it a try. I went and bought a fancy microphone and learned about how to podcast from YouTube, and just learned all the ins and outs of it and started the podcast.
Mm-hmm.
And I was starting to get feedback from people. The podcast started to grow. Um, Initially, I thought, well, this is never really going to go anywhere, and probably I'll drop it in about a year. But the feedback I was getting from people as they were starting to hear the podcast and listen to the podcast was is that they were really finding it valuable. And, just my style of it, just being conversational and just kind of laid back, people seemed to like that, and that seemed to resonate with them. So fast forward till today, the Practice of Therapy podcast probably averages anywhere from 6 to 7,000 downloads a month, which is just incredible.
Wow.
We're up to well over 300,000 total downloads since we started,
Mm-hmm.
and we just recently released our 300th episode. So it's yeah. So I think as much as anything, just being persistent and consistent, as I like to say, with it is what has helped it succeed and just kind of stay out there.
Yes, that's
Hmm.
impressive. So I
Yeah.
appreciate that, because as a lot of us podcasters are starting our journey, it's hard to really identify what success is, as with anything. And I
Hmm.
think we can get really caught up in those numbers, and
Right.
hearing that as a frame of reference, but also being mindful of the fact that this is a podcast that's been around for a long time. You've been persistent, you've been consistent. So a
Hmm.
reminder to people that that's really important. How have you kept the momentum alive? So you've gotten great feedback, and I'm sure that's helped. What are some other
Right.
things that keep you going?
Yeah, well, I think being able to the guests that I get, people like yourself and others that have been on the podcast or being on the podcast, I
Mm-hmm.
just love having those conversations and connecting with people on that level. I've gotten to interview some sort of famous people. I've had like Mike Michalowicz, who
Yeah.
is the author of Profit First. There's been a few others. I can't pull them up off the top of my head, but some
That's
other
great.
authors and publishers and that sort of thing. Some people that have YouTube channels, and so that is one thing that keeps me motivated, is being able to have those meaningful conversations like that. But I think also just as much as anything, too, on the tech side, is
Mm-hmm.
really learning how to automate as much of it as I can.
Sure.
After I got about 50 episodes in and just realizing the amount of time I was spending on doing all the back end stuff with the editing and that sort of thing, I ended up hiring a virtual assistant, Rachel, who's been with me since around the 50th episode, who does all of my editing, does the show notes and the graphics and social media and all of that. So all of that is totally outsourced for me. If
Yes.
it wasn't, I don't know that I would be able to keep it up with all
Mm-hmm.
the other things that I keep my hands in. So yeah, so that's been the a big part of the motivation, and then just one of the big themes that has come out for me over the last few years is just the necessity of community and having people that you're connected with on different levels. But as much as anything, that's how we get through all that we get through in life, is through those connections and through community and through meaningful relationships. And I think that's, another thing that's kept me going is that for me, podcasting is a great way to build community. And it's also, if you think about it, when we listen to podcasts, there's this vicarious kind of feeling of intimacy that's there. It's like you're having a conversation with one person or a small group of people.
Right.
And by listening to it, you feel like you're part of that conversation.
For sure.
And so, And so that's been something that's been, one of the motivators for me.
Oh,
Yeah, or several of those. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, those are great highlights. And for those listening that are maybe in the early stages or that are considering starting a podcast,
Mm-hmm.
a little intimidated by the idea, hearing from somebody like you that's in your position, that's really reassuring.
Wow,
So,
good. Yeah.
the network. So how
Yeah.
did that all come about? Because
Yeah.
I
So,
recognize that is just broadening the reach so much and enabling other people to really, it's more widespread. So how did that come about?
right. Well, I think as much as anything, again, when you think about community, I was having, there were several people that I had been in conversation with about, starting their own podcasts. And in particular, I've had a friend that was had a podcast in a different situation, but wanted to relaunch it.
Okay.
And so one of the things that they needed help with is just being able to kind of get the word out about their podcast, because there's all of that. And so it got the wheels turning of just thinking about, okay, what if we had a group of podcasters that were cross promoting each other in kind of that community way? And so that was the idea. And then just thinking about not only cross promotion, but being able to kind of pool our resources, pool our influence to help monetize our podcast as well.
Sure.
My podcast has had a long time sponsor, and they have. It was crazy. They reached out to me, I guess, and I was just kind of blown away by that. But they reached out to me to sponsor the podcast, and so that kind of built in some monetization and the ability to have the podcast pay for itself.
Mm-hmm.
And then, podcasting is a great marketing tool in many ways. I mean, I think you need to have quality content, but the more you're out there in front of people, it really helps build that know, like, and trust factor. And being able to, things that you want to promote or things that you are trying to sell, it's a really good way to do that.
I completely agree. So when you
Mm-hmm.
mention content and how
Mm-hmm.
much your network has grown and how you have a lot of podcasters in the same niche, how do you all ensure that the value is there and there isn't redundancy and that everyone kind of has their own spin on the interviews and the process?
Well, the good news, the easy answer to that, and not to sound too flippant, but
Yeah.
each of us are individuals, and so we have a different way of saying things, a different way of presenting things.
Sure.
And I don't know if you've run into this, Julia, but there have been times when I have had learning new stuff. For example, I was just thinking, when I go to learn something, or maybe you go to a seminar or something, and you hear something that you knew, but because it's presented in a little different way, it resonates differently.
Yes.
And it's kind of like it clicks. The book Profit First was one of those, an example of that for me. I knew a little bit about business finance, and I knew about bookkeeping and accounting and that kind of thing. by virtue of myself just teaching myself all those things
Sure.
as a practice owner. But when I heard or listened to Profit First and then read it, it just clicked, and it's kind of like, oh, this is how it all fits together. This is how it
Absolutely.
makes sense. It's I'm not a musician, but I know if you've ever known somebody that's a talented musician, particularly those that can just kind of pick up any instrument. I've got a friend that's like that. Can kind of pick up any instrument, and they just understand music and they understand the inner workings of it, and so it translates well across whatever instrument they're playing at a time, because there's
Mhm.
different fingerings and all that kind of stuff, but it resonates for them.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Well, that's another great point that those listening would benefit from hearing, because we all can get stuck in that, but it's been done before. And how
Hmm.
am I going to make it different? And we all do
Right.
have our own spin, whether that's
Right.
personality traits, our own unique experience, what's driving us to do what it is that we're doing. So even if the topics may be similar,
Right.
the
Right.
whole feel of it is different depending on who's relaying that message. So
Right.
that's
Right.
very
And
reassuring as
yeah,
well.
and I think part of the problem too, I think, is that in our own perspective, in our own little world, we don't recognize how big the rest of the world is, and just how
So
many people there
true.
are out there
Mhm.
that might want to hear your message. And it might be that you know you and I could be, Julia, you and I could be selling some sort of product, and it's
Mhm.
pretty much the same product, but your version of it's going to be a little different than my version of it, and your
Sure.
version might be much more appealing to some people than mine. And
Mhm.
so, yeah, and so it's the same concept.
Yes, and I so appreciate you saying that, because we also have different audiences, and even though there might be some overlap, there's somebody that may hear this episode with you, and like you said,
Mm-hmm.
it sinks in a different way, and it might inspire them to take action, because so much of it is timing and what's going
Mm-hmm.
on in their life. And so we shouldn't allow that to be a deterrent to prevent us from taking
Right.
imperfect action if there's
Right.
something we really feel driven to do. Would you agree?
Yeah, right, right. And it's about building relationships too. I mean, again, I'm full of metaphors today, but I think about, yeah, I think about the groups of friends that I have, and there are some friends where kind of our friend groups kind of overlap, others not so much.
Sure.
But, we got all those different contexts, and we're probably have different things that we do with different friends that
Yes.
aren't are all the same. And so a podcast can be kind of the same way. I mean, it might
Hmm.
be that what you're doing on a podcast resonates with a certain group of people, but it also could overlap with other groups of people.
Hmm. Absolutely. So,
Hmm.
share for people that aren't aware, what are some of the benefits of being a part of a network? So, you were saying the connections and the cross promotion. What's the
Yes.
structure and what does it look like?
Yeah, so with the PsychCraft Network, the way we've got it set up is I've been using a platform called Circle. I don't know
Hmm.
if you're familiar with it.
Yes.
It's fairly new platform within the last 2 or 3 years. It's
Hmm.
set up kind of like like social media. It's very similar to Facebook or LinkedIn, that kind of thing. I would say it's kind of a cross between Facebook and LinkedIn, but
Hmm.
it's not controlled by an algorithm or anything like that.
Okay.
And so it's a subscription service. But anyway, the network is mainly set up on there. And then we have office hours that we do once a month where we just get together and share ideas and talk about things. And then on the Circle platform, again, we share things with each other.
Hmm.
If there's something that one of us is promoting for a particular month, we will share that with each other, and then we can, you know, help each other promote it on our different podcasts. And then just, yeah, it's about networking and connections. And that's the big thing that the network does. We do have a web page, I mean, a website, psychcraftnetwork.com.
Mhm.
And so we've got all of us listed on there. And so if
Okay.
people are looking for other podcasts to listen to and that kind of thing, that's out there for
Mhm.
people to find it. So, but yeah, and it's, I think, I'm always looking for other people to join the network, other podcasts. So it's, yeah. And so it's continuing to grow in
Mhm.
that way. Yeah.
Oh, it sounds great. Another
Hmm.
thing that I was thinking about in reference to your last point is that a lot of times, because we are consuming information and with the algorithm and with the people we connect with online, we may get this false impression that the majority of the world is knowledgeable about the things that we're knowledgeable about or doing the things that we want to be doing, when in all reality, that's who we're surrounding ourselves with in those
Hmm.
networks. And so it's
Hmm.
so important to keep in mind that it, in a broader sense, your message still deserves to be heard from other people, and not everyone follows that same journey. We're just immersing ourselves with a lot of people that are doing
Right.
all of the things in the mental health profession.
Right. That's
So
right. That's right. Yeah.
yeah. Oh,
Yeah.
that's great.
Yeah.
So you had mentioned a little bit earlier that your podcasting journey and the blogging came from a lot of lessons that you had to learn the hard way. And
Yes.
so
Yes.
I didn't
Uh-huh.
know if there's anything that you could speak on with regard to practice, with regard to podcasting, that would be helpful for people that are listening, that will hopefully I think that a lot of us, so for me, I can relate to that. I definitely
Mm-hmm.
had a lot of the same experience that led me to consulting, that led me to podcasting. I didn't
Mm-hmm.
want people to have to struggle in the ways that I did, feverishly search for information, have to go through multiple sources to get where they needed to.
Mm-hmm.
And I think in sharing our experience a lot of times and being a little bit more vulnerable, we connect on a deeper level to people. There's more of that relatability and that
Yes.
normalizing.
Mm-hmm.
So, for those people that are maybe in the struggle right now, is there anything that you could speak to with your different journeys that have been a positive learning experience and that you've
Yeah.
come out on the other side?
Yeah. Well, I'd say number one is don't try to do too much of it alone. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, I wish I had, I was the consummate bootstrapper, and I like, I've always said I'm a tinkerer, so I like figuring things out. I like learning new things, but it's not the best necessarily the best way to go about it. And I know that when I have been involved with things like mastermind groups, uh, coaching, all of those kinds of things, my practice and my other businesses or endeavors have grown exponentially by
Yeah.
that because you get a new perspective. We can kind of get tunnel vision, I think, to some degree in the things that we do. And yeah, and so we get stuck. And so I
Yeah.
think by having community, I think having regular people, trusted colleagues is something too, is having those people that you can be totally vulnerable with and, even share your numbers and talk about, all of those kinds of things is an important thing to be able to do. And when you, by doing that, you're going to, you're going to get ahead quicker.
Yeah.
And the other thing I'll say too, I mentioned bootstrapping. I think we try to do one mistake that I still am trying to learn this lesson. Haven't quite learned it yet, but I try to do way too much on my own rather than outsourcing.
Sure.
So and so I think one of the biggest returns on anybody's investment in private practice or any sort of business is start to outsource sooner and find people that you can hand stuff off to and not necessarily do it all yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Hmm.
It's so helpful to hear. And it's something that I've heard before, but I'm hoping even if those listeners are in the same position, that maybe hearing it this time it sinks in.
Hmm.
Because we can very easily in the beginning get so overwhelmed at. Fortunately, our businesses do not cost a lot to get started, depending on our
Hmm.
circumstance and if we're
Right,
in
right.
person or
Hmm.
virtual. But it does take time to generate some of that income, especially if you're an insurance-based practice and you have to wait for the credentialing and then wait to get on the pay cycle and there might be an insurance issue. And so, with that being said, we can be very cautious and risk averse, and finding the right people can be so hard.
Mm-hmm.
That's actually what led me to start my podcast. Is I was struggling to find people on my team, not just my counseling practice, but an attorney, an accountant, a financial planner that operated from a place of integrity and that shared some of my values and that were not just financially driven and that actually wanted to teach me, because I am similar to you. I want to understand it. I want to figure it out. I don't have to necessarily be the one doing it, but I want to know that if I'm paying money for something, it's worth that investment. And then
Right.
I have that peace of mind and I know I've made the right choice. So my hope in the podcast was that I could find those people that do operate from a place of integrity and do have that compassion and that empathy. And fortunately, it has really helped to surround myself and have those conversations with people that share that value system.
Yes,
But speaking
yes.
to that, I think it's not only for some people the expense, but I think it can also be finding that right person. It's that trust. Is someone that is going to do it not only as well as you, but better than you in some
Right, right.
and that you have obviously invested a lot if it's your own
Mm-hmm.
business, and then to pass that off to someone can be really hard to do. Can you speak on that if there's someone on the fence about whether or not outsourcing is right for them?
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things to recognize, particularly for those of us as therapists, the most important asset we have is our time and expertise, and that's what people come to us and pay us for.
Sure.
And so, if I just to make up some numbers here, if I'm charging $100 per session, and I hire somebody, even if I'm paying them $30 an hour to respond to phone calls, to do intakes, that sort of thing. If they free me up for 1 hour, it pays for itself. And
Right.
so being able to think about it in terms of return on investment. Another example, a simple example of return on investment are, a good investment, I think, for any practice, even though they might, depending on their area, they might be kind of a crowded kind of platform, but the Psychology Today profiles, if you get one client from that, it pays for itself. I mean, you think about, all you have to do is do the math. You're charging again, hypothetically, $100 a session, and the person comes to you for what's an average length of stay, maybe 8 sessions with somebody. The math's easy on that one.
Absolutely. It's
Yeah.
a great point and a helpful mindset shift,
Yeah.
because as many people have said before me, we do not get specific business training, marketing training, unless we seek that out as mental health practitioners. And so for us, it's not an automatic flip in our minds, but hearing that from those of us that have been doing it for a while and successful at it will hopefully get through to some of those that might be a little bit more hesitant.
Right. Yeah. And I think too, just to have more of an investment mindset
Sure.
with things. If I were to, if I were to say to you, Julia, give me $20 and I'll give you 100 back, what would you do? Yeah. And so that $20 is not lost, but it's multiplied. So.
Right. But I think society-wide, we've become so accustomed to instant gratification, and we want to see those results now. And there's not necessarily anything wrong with that, but it's this whole mentality of we're in it for the long game.
Right.
And as we start to have more and more examples, I think that becomes easier. But in the beginning stages, we haven't had that yet.
Right.
And we also don't always understand everything that goes on behind the scenes. And you mentioned that when you were talking about who you would hire to help with your own show. And I mean, not only with podcasting, right, but also with group practice and a lot of these other endeavors, until you've actually done it, having somebody share that, or sometimes we don't even know in the places that we work all that's going on behind the scenes. And I don't know about you, but I have so much more respect and appreciation for everywhere that I worked prior to now. All the supervisors and bosses that I have that were just trying to do the best they could.
Right. Yeah. I think that's true for all of us. Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I
Yeah.
appreciate that. You've given a lot of tips today for people, and I hope those listening that might be considering any pursuit, these are applicable tips across the board to take
Hmm.
some action. Don't be afraid to get help, network, find connections, get your people to support you and back you up, and that it really will help promote that longevity that you obviously have had, which is
Yes.
incredible.
Yeah.
So for
And
people that want to find you, obviously there are these 2 podcasts that they can
yes.
listen to.
Yes. Well, they can, yeah,
Network.
the 2 places they can find me, they can go to practiceoftherapy.com,
Okay.
and all my stuff is there. And also they can check out the network by just going to psychcraftnetwork.com.
Awesome.
Hmm.
Great stuff. Anything else that you'd like to share or that you have in the works? I mean, you've got a full plate. This is plenty.
Yeah. Yeah. I would just reiterate, learn how to connect with people and find those things that you can do that bring you meaning and help you grow. And as there's a quote I love by Joseph Campbell, and it's just follow your bliss, and when you do that, doors will open in places where you didn't know there were doors. And so that's I'm paraphrasing the quote, but that's
Yeah.
that's kind of it. I think find those things, find your passion, know your why. All of those kinds of things I
Sure.
think are important.
But I also see how what you were referencing before lines up with that, where when you find what you're passionate about and what your purpose is, if there's all of that minutia getting in the way and those things that are not within your zone of genius, then finding somebody else to do that for you, where maybe it is their zone of genius, is just going to free you up for the really enjoyable stuff.
Right. Right.
Awesome.
That's
Well,
right.
that's a great note to end on. I so appreciate not only your time and what you shared here, but your contribution to this field and all that you're doing. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Julia. Thanks for having me on the podcast.
Absolutely. If you like what you're hearing, please rate and review. This will help others find us and benefit as well. The Compassionate Climb podcast represents the opinions of Julia Napini and her guests. The information provided is intended for educational purposes only and should not be taken as legal advice. If that is what you are seeking, please consult an attorney.